Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian podcast. This is season 8, episode 14, and today I'm very pleased to have on my podcast Theresa Carle-Sanders, who has a new cookbook out, Castle Rock Kitchen: Wicked Good Recipes from the World of Stephen King. And we wanted to highlight this for our Halloween episode, but I also want to mention that Theresa is known very much for her Outlander cookbooks. If you're a fan of the TV show or you've read all the books, you'll know her work. She has 2 of the Outlander cookbooks, volume 1 and 2, and they're just magnificent. So I was really happy to get a chance to talk to Theresa about her previous career, her life in writing, and the process of writing and contacting the famous authors that she's based her work on. She's just a lively, fun guest, and I really enjoyed having a chance to talk to her. I hope I get to have her on the program again. Her Castle Rock Kitchen cookbook was very important to me as I'm a really big fan of Stephen King. And so it was really kind of delicious to kind of go through the cookbook and read some of the recipes and see the references and the notes and excerpts from King's writing there. I have a very, very fond place for the book in my heart, and I have a very loved copy, and I know that you will when you get it for yourself. Without further ado, I'm just going to go right to my conversation with Theresa, and so you can listen to it too and hear what she has to say. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian podcast. Today, I am very, very honored to have on my program Theresa Carle-Sanders, who is a professional chef, food writer, and unabashed fan of Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series. She lives in a small island in the Salish Sea between Vancouver and Victoria in Canada. She is the author of the Outlander Kitchen cookbooks, volumes 1 and 2, and the new Stephen King Castle Rock Kitchen: Wicked Good Recipes from the World of Stephen King. Theresa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about your background and your work before you started cooking. But one of the threads that I have with all my guests that seems to be very prevalent is there was somebody in their past, usually a parent or a grandparent or a relative or friend that kind of inspired them to cooking. Who is that for you, and where did cooking begin for you?
I always give credit for my love of food to my dad, because my dad really loved good food. Even in the 70s, back when it wasn't quite such a hot topic, he went to Europe for work. He was very lucky and went to Europe a lot for work, and he developed a good taste for good wine and good food. And so he and I cooked together and often went shopping down to the docks to get shrimp, down to the bakery to get bread on Sunday morning. Always something fresh and good, out to the berry farms to get strawberries and blueberries the first of the season. So he was a big influence. My mom was the family cook, so she's a big influence too. And I was also influenced by my grandmothers. There's lots of people in my background that started me off.
Would you say that there's some of them in the Castle Rock Kitchen cookbook?
Oh yes, definitely the voices of my grandmothers as well as my mother comes through. It's meant to be a Maine narrator. None of those people I've just talked about are from Maine, but they're all old, practical, good, solid thinkers and good, solid cooks. And so they did contribute to the narrative for sure.
Now, I want to talk about your background. Before you came into cooking, you have a very impressive background. What did you do before you started writing?
Before I started writing, I was I guess the very first, my most favorite job I ever had was actually I ran the warehouse for the Vancouver Food Bank back in 1995 through 97. And that was a really satisfying job. But unfortunately, it didn't pay the bills in a great way. So I got recruited by FedEx, and I ended up running the downtown of Vancouver core for them, their operations manager, which was a big job. And I was, I believe, 28 or 29 at the time. Everybody that worked for me was at least 10 or 15 years older. And it was a really, actually, at the end of it, I didn't like it. I thought I was a corporate girl. I got through all the interviews. They thought I was a corporate woman and a career woman, but it just didn't work. It was too much. Management is not for me. That's what I discovered. And slowly the creative bit of me came out, which was a real surprise to everyone, myself included.
Now, is that when you had your big reboot?
It is. I had a really bad experience with a very nasty customer in the FedEx office, and I ended up taking a long walk and deciding it wasn't for me, and I quit then. And my husband, I remember he was, I think, happier than myself. He had been wanting me to do it for a long time. And I walked into a bookstore the next day that I gave them 2 weeks. And then the first day I walked into a bookstore and I found a red and black book with a clock on the cover, and that was Outlander. And that's where my reboot began, really. I really leaned into Outlander for a very long time, 2 or 3 years. I've read them over and over, and Diana Gabaldon fans will say the same thing. Many of us have read them over and over and over. And then that's when we moved from Vancouver to Pender Island.
What is it like living on an island? Must be, I mean, fantastical. I can't imagine what it must be like.
It is. We actually don't live there anymore. The bios all need to be updated. We moved across the country, but that's another story. And we'll get to that. But Pender Island is between Vancouver and Victoria. And so it's a 2-hour ferry ride from Vancouver. It is very much idyllic on the surface. There's 2,500 people. During the pandemic, for example, we couldn't leave, though, unless it was an emergency for the first 6 months. So we were really stuck on the island. But but you make good friends, and you hopefully don't make too many enemies because you see them almost every day. And it's a big rainforest. That's what, it's just north of Seattle. So if you think of the climate of Seattle, it's rainy a lot of the time, but Pender is known as the Mediterranean of Canada. So there's actually olive trees, and the island next door actually has an olive farm where they press olive oil. So there's all these little microclimates, and it's really beautiful. And Pender is actually one of the sunniest places in Canada.
I would never expect that. That's crazy.
No, I had 3 olive trees in my backyard. They weren't old enough to really get a lot of olives out of, but I got a few olives every year, and I would put them in my martini.
Nice. Your first cookbook, or should I say a pair of cookbooks, were based on the work of Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series, and they're called the Outlander Kitchen. They begin with an email to Diana Gabaldon. Can we talk about that? I love that story.
Okay, for sure. I like that story too. It's a magical story, and it takes place on Pender. I was out walking with the dog in the woods, and all of a sudden, I was a super fan, as I said, a particular dish popped into my head from Voyager, which is the 3rd book in the series. And it's pigeon rolls stuffed with pigeons and truffles. And it's just so aromatic. There's just so many things about those pigeon rolls. There's so many levels to them, but I could smell them, I could taste them, everything in the middle of the woods. And I kind of ran home after that with the dog in tow. And I was composing an email in my head and also writing a recipe in my head. And I wrote to Diana Gabaldon and asked her permission to publish it on my food blog. I had a blog at the time, islandvittles.com. It's no longer around. And we put it up, and she shared it across her social media, and it was really very popular. So I did another recipe. I did Brianna's Bridies, which is from Drums of Autumn, which is Brianna's just about to set sail for America, and she buys a meat hand pie, and they're really, really good. And so we put that up, and then I started asking about a cookbook, fishing around. But at that time, Outlander wasn't a TV series yet. So
Right.
There were millions of fans, but there weren't tens of millions of fans, which is what I was told we needed. And when the TV show went into production, that's when very quickly Outlander Kitchen, the first Outlander official cookbook, came to life.
What was it like working with Diana Gabaldon? Like, I want to ask you about the process of the research and kind of having things go by her. Was that kind of daunting?
Well, I've known her. I've had an email relationship with her, and I've met her several times now, but since 2009. So she knows my name. When my email comes up, I like to think she reads it. She doesn't have time to read everybody's.
Yeah.
And she's always answered me. She's always been very supportive, and she said yes. I mean, she flew me. She's the one that paid for my airline ticket to fly down to Scottsdale to do the launch of the first Outlander Kitchen in her hometown, and we sold 3,000 books that night. So she's very smart. She's very quick. She's got good wit, and she's very generous. And so she really gave, once I had the proposal for Outlander Kitchen done, she looked it over, she approved it, gave me her approval, and really didn't step in at any other time unless I needed to ask a question. And I do from time to time need to ask a question just for clarification. But I asked her if she wanted to put a recipe in, but she didn't have time because that's when the TV show was really taking off, and she was actually even writing for the TV show at that time.
Now, speaking of the TV show, what was it like for you as a fan of her work to get to finally watch this work made into a TV show? Were you kind of nervous about initially watching it, worried about being disappointed? How did you feel about it?
Yeah, I was worried. I've seen other adaptations of books that I love go really badly. And but I was actually down in San Diego for Comic-Con for the premiere of that very first episode, and we were in an old theater with I think there were probably 300 or 400 of us, rabid old lady fans, and it was amazing. That premiere, that first episode is amazing, and I think Sam Heughan is a really wonderful Jamie.
Yes.
And I think Katrina Balfe is a very, very, very good Claire. I don't now. They've unfortunately taken over in my head, so I don't really remember what my Jamie and Claire look like in my head anymore. That's one of the things that we lose. But I just saw the premiere the poster for the upcoming season, and I have to say, with who's in it, I'm more excited than I have been for many seasons. I think I'm not a terribly visual person. My husband is actually in England right now. He's been gone for over a week. I haven't turned the TV on since he's been gone. So I'm a reader.
Yeah.
And that's what Outlander will always be to me. There'll always be books, but I enjoy the series, and my husband really enjoys the series, so we watch it together.
I never read the books, but I would now that I've seen the series, and I like the series very much. My wife wanted to watch it, so I was like, okay, let's watch this and see what it's about. And just after the first episode, I got hooked because it's that good of a story, and the characters are that good, and I just fell in love with it. It was heartbreaking for me when some of the characters died. I think when Dougal died, I felt such a loss, as though a relative had died.
Very much so, yeah. And you actually sound like a book fan, so maybe you should give the first one a try anyway, or even just the first three. The first three are almost a complete, like you could stop there and not go on, because they're at some point you have to decide if you want to read another 1,000 pages. They're all 1,000 pages now.
I have no doubt I would love it. I mean, I can't imagine not loving them. The stories are that good.
Yes, she really does a good research, and they're smart.
Do you have any favorite characters from the series? That's a hard question. I know, I'm probably unfair.
It is a hard question. I mean, my very favorite is, oh God, sorry, I've gone completely blank. The Frenchman, the guy that looks like a frog.
Yeah.
Okay. I can't believe it, because he is my very, very favorite in the whole world. What's his name? Anyway.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, but anyway, let me start again, and I'll think I can think of another one. One of my very favorite characters is Fergus. I like the growth of Fergus. We meet him as a young boy, and he could be a very tragic character. And talk about luck. He certainly has a lucky day when Jamie finds him. And he goes on, and as an adult character in the books, he's hilarious. He's very funny. He's also very poignant, and there is a bit of tragicness about him.
What a great actor they got to play him as well.
He is. He's really good, isn't he?
Yeah, this was fantastic. He'll be a star, I'm sure. Now, did you have to do any kind of historical research for the writing to kind of look up a lot of like old Scottish and English recipes?
Yes, I have a number of cookbooks on my shelf that are, Mrs. McNeil's Scottish Kitchen the from the mid 18th century. The problem with those is a lot of them start with something like, procure yourself a fresh sheep's head and scrape the nostrils, scrape the hairs from its nostrils with a spoon, which is Pau Saudi, which is something that Diana actually mentions a couple of times across a couple of different books. So I modernize things. I like to go back in history and find the original recipe, and then I like to work from it on there as well.
Was the second volume of the cookbooks any easier or harder to write?
It was it's just the same. The process is the same, and I've really got a good process now where I read on a Kindle and I highlight everything as I go, and then when it comes to sort of once I've finished all the books, then I pour them all into an Excel spreadsheet, and then I start sorting things in the order of a table of contents of cookbooks, and how I go through and pick which, in Outlander, for example, bread and ale, like 400 times across 10 books, easily, she says bread and ale. And the same for oatmeal. So you have to pick the best excerpt, the one that is poignant. It's maybe got a conversation, or someone's in a temper, or someone is expressing love. That's what we do around food. We generally, around a table, we tend to gather, and then important conversations are had with family when we're eating together. And that's what I really like about Outlander. Stephen King actually does it quite a bit too. Surprisingly, I was surprised when I started looking.
Yeah.
But it's really the art of picking the best excerpt to go with that mention of the food, so that everybody, the more you flip through the cookbook, the more you're drawn into the story.
This episode is sponsored by Culinary Historians of Northern California, a Bay Area educational group dedicated to the study of food, drink, and culture in human history. To learn more about this organization and their work, please visit their website at www.chnorcal.org. Do you have any Scottish heritage?
No, probably. I'm Danish on my mother's side, and my father's side is a bit of a mystery because my grandmother was an orphan, and all of her records were burned in the church fire when she was a young girl. So we don't really know, but we suspect that it's either Scottish or Irish or something like that.
Very nice.
Some sort of Celtic.
So, Castle Rock Kitchen, how did that come to be for you?
That was after I'd finished the second Outlander cookbook, and I was looking for a new project, and I knew I wanted to do another fictional cookbook just because I'm a fan and I like being in fandoms, and I've discovered that it's much easier for me as an author to sell to an existing fandom, and I really want to reach as many people as I can with these books. So when I was trying to decide who I would maybe want to try and work with next, I needed an author who is prolific. So there's lots of books out there that I can draw from. One that has a big fandom, and Stephen King, those two certainly tick the boxes very well. And then the third thing I need is for them to write about food and to use food as a prop, not rather than just as an aside. And so I started reading them, and I have read most of them before in my early 20s, early 30s, but I hadn't been looking for the food at that point. So I read Carrie. I started and read them in order, and Carrie has a hamburger and a root beer, and that's quite worrying.
Yeah.
But then so I proceeded on, and Salem's Lot had a really nice sounding spaghetti sauce.
Yeah.
And then The Shining comes along, and there's a lot of food in The Shining, and a lot of cocktails, obviously. And then it just got better. The food evolved as I kept reading, and Stephen King went from a small town Maine author to a more worldly individual. Things started creeping in, like in Elevation, which was his last book that was published at the time when I started. There's a gourmet Mexican restaurant in Castle Rock, Maine. So that's how it started. And I knew I could do it. About halfway through, I would say maybe 20 books in, I knew I could do it. And that's when I started putting a proposal together and telling my wonderful agent that she had to figure out how to get in contact with Stephen King.
Have you got a chance to talk to Stephen King?
I have. I've spoken on the phone with him for half an hour. He was very generous. He told stories. Yeah, everybody always says that.
It's like talking to God.
And he's so humble, and he won't let you call him anything but Steve. And he told me stories of his mom cooking. So, his mom they did not have a lot of money. His mom was a single mother. And after work, she would go to the IGA and buy the day-old lobster, which was at that point probably 19 cents a pound. And so over the course of a week, she would just continually add that lobster to the pot. And that's what in Castle Rock Kitchen I've called a poor man's soup. And the story is, I think a lot of Mainers tell that story. This story is when the minister came around on Sunday for tea, then that poor man's soup went back out on the porch so that the minister didn't know they were eting poor people's food and prisoners' food, because that's what lobster was. It was food for prisoners.
It's funny how that's changed.
Yeah. And it's not, there's nowhere in the world where lobster is cheap anymore. It's expensive everywhere now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've often seen food as a touchstone in Stephen King's work. I remember most specifically The Stand, when a character was trapped in a cell and couldn't get out, and he was thinking of food, and I still have that image in my mind to this day of the ham with red eye gravy, which I've never even had, but it's still, he's such a good writer that it sticks in your brain. And so many others. Were there any favorite touchstones in one of his books for you that, as you read through his works, looking for stuff to find?
From The Stand, Mother Abigail's fried chicken. So she goes on that long walk, and she's got ferrets or something chasing her, and she's killed the chickens anyway. And she makes up a batter and she fries it, and then she makes pie. I really like that scene. The other scene I really like, the other thing I really like is the pie from Thinner. And those actually are two books that we didn't end up including in Castle Rock Kitchen just because we wanted a focus. The editor asked me for a focus, and we decided on Maine. So it's a Maine-centric cookbook. It focuses on all the stories he's written that take place in Maine. So those don't include The Stand, for example. Although The Stand does start in Maine, and I could have used a couple of things. I decided just to leave The Stand alone for now. We'll see what happens with The Stand later. And so I left The Dark Tower behind, but I did leave Thinner behind, The Shining, Annie Wilkes, and Misery as well. So there's some really iconic books that are not in there, but there's some really great opportunities to get to know some of his short stories. I've used some excerpts from short stories that not everybody reads, but I've really enjoyed them. I've read 60 Stephen King books over the last 3 years, and I've multiple times, most of them multiple times, and I've really enjoyed those short stories.
I remember specifically reading, I've reread some of his books so many times, and I remember reading Salem's Lot again and realizing that Barlow, the vampire, was down in the like kind of a rec room of the boarding house with the canned goods. And somebody who cans, I think I was more angry about that than anything else. I was like, how dare he be near the canned goods? Did you have any? Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Do you have any favorite bits and quotes like that from your rereadings? Did you rediscover his work when you did the research for the book?
Oh yeah, very, very much so. And there were so many books that I hadn't read, like 1120. Well, I had read 11/22/63 because it's a time travel story, and I'll read anything time travel. But there's the Dark Tower series I had never read, and I really like fantasy. I know not everybody's fantasy fans, but
Mhm.
I really like fantasy. The Dark Tower series, it's 8,000 pages worth of reading. It took a very, very, very long time. And again, we didn't include it because it doesn't take place in Maine. But I really, and as well as his mystery series, his more modern works,
Which
I
I
wasn't
love.
as familiar with. And I really, everybody thinks he's a horror writer and he's creepy, and he doesn't really write a lot of horror anymore.
Yeah.
There's always some sort of angle to it, but not the nasty horror of, some people don't want to read The Shining or something like that. There's lots of opportunity for new stuff from him.
Now, I want to talk with our listeners about the style of the book, because you touched on this when you were talking about it earlier, but there's a very specific style and look to it. And I was really intrigued by it because I loved the way you fleshed out the book and making it look very centric to Castle Rock. Can you talk about the design? And did you have any problems also additionally with the publishing, kind of relaying this to the publisher?
No, the publisher, 10 Speed Press, took this book very seriously from the beginning, and I'm very grateful for that. When I brought the proposal to them, it didn't have the main focus, and because of the main focus, it's a much better cookbook. It's a regional cookbook as well as a Stephen King cookbook, and it's an old-fashioned we're talking about a lot of his original stories of when he was younger, in the sort of 50s, 60s. And so it's that old-fashioned rural Maine that's really charming. Sorry, I've forgotten the question.
That's okay. No, you did it perfectly. I was going to ask you, do you have any favorite, now doing the research and cooking, were there any recipes in there that you had not really cooked before, like say boiled dinner or brown bread? Were there anything that you hadn't cooked but that kind of became new for you?
Boiled dinner was not one I had ever heard of before, and I really I really like that. I'm a fan of slow all day cooking, and it feeds a family for it can do for days. So I really enjoyed that. Things like potato stuffing, things like some of the pantry ingredients that they use, I was unfamiliar with. And again, it was the pandemic when I was writing, so I was stuck on Pender Island and I couldn't go anywhere. So I used the internet, and Maine has an incredible archive. They've archived every agricultural pamphlet, every seafood pamphlet. I found them all online. And I also found Marjorie Standish, who's an old newspaper columnist from Portland. And she used to write a column every Sunday, I think it was, and good old plain cooking. And all of those things came together to really boost the book and make it into a Maine-centric book. And then we gave the narrator a voice other than mine, really to put you all the way into that world, all the way into Stephen King. You can have 250 pages where you don't ever have to leave that world. And the narrator's name is Mrs. Garrity. She comes from The Long Walk. It's the first novel Stephen King ever wrote as a 19-year-old man, but he published it as under Bachman when he was in the Bachman books. And Mrs. Garrity is the mother of the protagonist. We don't even know her first name. She has maybe 6 lines of dialogue in the whole book.
Yeah.
And but what she does have is that she's born and bred Mainer. She's lived there her whole life. She's stuck there because The Long Walk is a dystopian novel. She's not going anywhere. And she also lives in the future. And so she's heard all of those stories of Stephen King's Maine. And so I use her voice. I didn't want to use an existing Stephen King character that had a big voice, like let's say Dolores Claiborne, who Stephen King told me is his most Maine character he's ever written. But I didn't want to copy her voice because I wouldn't pull it off, and B, I wouldn't pull it off. And I was really scared, I'll be honest. It's a huge leap in my creative writing to think I can do this. And through Mrs. Garrity, I think I've managed to pull it off. I'm pretty happy. I'm very happy, actually. And I'm very proud of that voice. And like we said before, it includes my mother, my grandmother, some of the other mothers in It, for example. There's a group of mothers in It, and their voices are in there too. And Dolores Claiborne's is definitely in there. When he told me She was the main character. I read that novel 2 more times, and I don't know if you've ever read it. It's very hard to read.
Yeah.
It's in first person with almost no punctuation.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw a lot of that though in the book. Now, what did Stephen King think of the book? Were you nervous handing it in to him?
Oh, you better believe it. Yeah, I was. I think, and I was nervous with Diana Gabaldon as well, right? I mean, it's a big thing to put your creativity in front of somebody who is so awesomely creative. And he really liked it. I mean, he sent back a foreword, which was is going to help the book enormously. And it's a funny foreword. I think it's very Stephen King-y.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's tweeted it out on launch day for us. So I know he's happy with it, because he's actually given me permission to go through and maybe look and see if I can't find enough food for another one.
Who are some of the food writers that inspire you as a chef?
As a chef, I love cookbooks. Cookbook authors I love are Dory Greenspan, Erin French, who not everyone may be familiar with. She's a Maine chef, and I had her book, The Lost Kitchen, as part of my research, and she makes beautiful food, and she writes in a really beautiful way. And then the other one I like, and this one may not be known to everybody either, is Vikram Vij, and he's a Vancouver chef. He had restaurants, he still has them, but they were really hot in the 90s. And he used to have all these celebrities coming to his restaurant, and he was the best host, but he and his wife wrote 3 cookbooks, and they're beautiful Indian cookbooks that I refer to all the time.
It's funny you mentioned Dory Greenspan. My last 3 guests all cited her as well. And I had her on the show, and she was like meeting Stephen King. She was like meeting God, and such a nice, also humble person like Stephen. She's just such a nice person. And yeah, I really love her work. She's just outstanding, and just a wonderful writer to read in general.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I want to ask this question. I know this is kind of a greedy question because you're on tour and you're doing work for your cookbook. What's next for you?
Well, like I just hinted at, Stephen King has given me permission to look again. We've got a lot of books that we didn't include because we focused on Maine.
Oh.
And I've touched upon it in the past that I really like fantasy. And I know the Dark Tower fans would like to see a cookbook that is fantasy focused. And there's lots of satellite stories that all refer back to the Dark Tower. The Stand is one of them. Randall Flagg is in both books. So if Randall Flagg is in the book, I can use it. Randall Flagg is also in Eyes of the Dragon, which is a more young adult sort of fantasy that Stephen King wrote for his daughter in the 80s.
Yeah.
But there's lots of short stories, Low Men in Yellow Coats, From Hearts of Atlantis, and other things. There's lots of material to draw upon. And so I have my spreadsheet, and it's actually almost complete. So we're just going to see how this book sells. And then hopefully we'll move on to, I don't know what we'll call it. Dark Tower Kitchen. I don't know. Castle Rock Kitchen 2. I don't know. We'll see.
I am very looking forward to this, and I can't wait to see this come out as well. I really loved Castle Rock Kitchen. It was a really beautiful work, and I think it's going to do very well. You don't have to worry about that at all.
Oh, thank you. That's fine. Jenny Bravo did all the photos. I have to mention the photos because they bring the whole book together, and they give it this creepy, eerie, mouth-watering vibe. And it's very hard to pull off with some of those recipes. A lot of it is brown food, and she's made it all look really good.
There was a beautiful style to the book. And I also noticed the type font as well. And just the whole thing. I mean, 10-speed press is always good. They're just outstanding all the way around. So anything they put out, yeah. I'm not surprised. It's wonderful.
Yeah, the art director did an amazing job. I'm blown away still when I look at it, and I've been looking at it for a couple of months now. So
now, you said that you moved from your island. Where are you living now? We
now live, funnily enough, not too far from Stephen King. We've moved to New Brunswick, which is
nice.
New Brunswick is across the country, directly on the other side of the country, And I was actually just down in Bangor, Maine last weekend. I just took a spontaneous road trip down there. It took me 3 hours to get down there. So that's how far I live from Stephen King's old house. He doesn't live there anymore. He lives sort of in another town, and then spends a lot of his time in Florida now.
That's wonderful. Theresa, I really want to thank you for being on the podcast, and I love getting to talk to you about your books, and I look forward to seeing more work from you. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Dean.
That was my conversation with Theresa Carle-Sanders. Her book, Castle Rock Kitchen, Wicked Good Recipes from the works of Stephen King, is out now. You can buy it online. We have links in the bio. You can also get it at all better bookstores. Tomorrow, we're going to have two of my favorite guests of all time on the show. Ian McEnroe and Mariana Nuno Ruiz McEnroe will be on talking about their book, Dining with the Dead, A Feast for the Souls on the Day of the Dead. I've been really prolific lately talking about this book online and social media, urging people to get it. It's hands down one of my favorite books of all time. I love this book. I want to be buried with it. I will always have a copy of this somewhere within reach. It's just one of my favorite books, and I think it's one of the most important works on Mexican cooking available. So I really urge you to get this. It's a great book. And check out this rebroadcast again tomorrow on the actual Day of the Dead to listen to their conversation with them. It was wonderful. I was delighted. I hope I get to have them on the program again. We're so lucky to have on the program tomorrow also Andreas Feistad, who's a TV personality who I'm sure you've seen on NPR. And he has a new work of food writing called Dinner in Rome. It's a kind of history of food of Rome and how it's interconnected with all things. Very important work. I can't really talk about it enough as far as it's just a really great book and so interesting and fascinating and full of just great information. I highly recommend it to you. We also talk about his other books as well and his restaurant. He was a great guest. I was so honored to have him on the program that he was so gracious to give some of his time to be on it. And we'll have links to all that information in his bio as well. That's going to go tomorrow. So we have a two for tomorrow, a rebroadcast of my talk with the authors of Dining with the Dead, and also my talk with Andreas Feistad with his new book, Food Writing, Dinner in Rome. So I hope you all had a really great time listening to my interview with Theresa Carle-Sanders. I hope you all are having a great time today on Halloween, and you get to cook some really great stuff. So keep on cooking.
I've been getting